I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitchin Quilts, and today we're going to be going over Block 8 of our Parable series. Block 8 finishes as a 12-inch block, and it follows the parable of the servants who must remain watchful. We find that parable in Mark chapter 13, verses 35 through 37. You can see here that I've created the block in two different colorways because I'm completing my quilt in two colorways. The block is fairly easy to construct, but it has some confusing parts when you're looking at some of these units, these arrows here, that have both a light and a dark side that gives them a three-dimensional effect. So I have some special instructions in the pattern and some special instructions on the video to help you as you go along your way. If you would please, before we begin, let's open with prayer. Our prayer was provided to us by Trudy Double. Abba Father, we are your children whose love for you knows no bound, as the parables tell us. We are your servants, faithfully awaiting your return, watching for your return. Help us through this adventure of quilting your parables to reach those that do not know you. With each stitch, we will pray for the foolish servants that have not recognized you as their Lord and Savior, those that do not know you as their loving Father. Be with us today as we gather together and receive our new blocks and carry on spreading your word. In your holy name, Jesus the Christ, amen. Let's get started. Let's take a look at the pattern. On page 1 of the pattern, I include an image of the block, the cutting instructions, the parable, and a reflection on the parable. Block 8 has several steps, so the pattern is multiple pages. At the beginning of page 2, at the top, before you begin, I provide a chart for you so you can keep track of your fabrics that go into the light and dark arrow sections of the block. You'll note that I have L1 and D1 listed for the light and the dark arrow that's on the outside here shown as blue, and L2, D2 indicated for the light and dark sections of the inner arrow shown as green. Once you substitute your fabrics, you'll place your fabrics in the sections where they're indicated. Beginning with step 1, the instructions are included on completing the block. Instructions continue through page 3 and assembling the block on page 4. This block, when it was first introduced in 1975, was called Night Watch. So on page 5, I indicate why I chose Night Watch to represent this particular parable and space for your own personal reflection. When choosing fabrics for this block, it's important to really avoid directional fabrics. I'm doing my blocks in two different colorways for my quilts. So in one of the colorways, this is a predominant background fabric. I've chosen this for my background. It has just a touch of blues, purples, and reds in it. So for my outer arrow, I have this dark blue and light blue. For my inner arrow, I have a dark green and a light green. And it is important that the values of the darks and the light are pretty similar. So you can see the value of my dark blue and my dark green are similar. The value of my light blue and light green are similar. For my contrast, I've chosen this red that appears in other places throughout the quilt, but it also picks up just a touch of the red from my background fabric. In my other colorway, I've chosen this buttery cream yellow with a pin dot for my background. I could have gone with the lighter yellow for my background, but I'll show you why I've chosen this one. Again, I've avoided directional fabrics. For my dark outer arrows, they're blue, and both of these fabrics appear in other blocks on my quilt. For my inner arrow, I've gone with a salmon color. There's my dark and the value is similar. And my light is the same fabric, but the value is similar to my light blue here. So I'll like the way these fabrics can play off of each other, and they are non-directional, so it shouldn't be a problem. For my contrast, I've chosen this darker burgundy grunge. Again, nothing's directional here, so I shouldn't have any difficulty. Now, I had chosen originally this lighter, buttery background fabric. The reason why I chose it, because it brings out the yellows in my prints. I also have the possibility of using this lighter yellow for the background fabric, and I thought that I would work on the blocks and see which one I liked the best. Before we begin cutting, it's important to press out any little wrinkles that are in the fabric so that your cutting is accurate. I do that with a dry iron so I don't stretch my fabric. The arrow units require 4 squares that are the same size of all 4 fabrics of your light and dark outer and inner arrow. So you can layer these fabrics on top of each other to make those cuts easier. It's important to remove the selvages first. This fabric doesn't have selvage, so I'll work on removing those selvages first. The pattern calls to cut 4 2 7/8 inch squares, and I like to use a ruler that has very specific 1/8 inch markings, so I have a Marty Michelle ruler that I'm using because the 1/8 inch is very easy to see. It's easiest to cut through 4 fabrics when you have a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter. Once I have those squares cut to 2 7/8 inches, I need to cut them in half once diagonally. Personally, I prefer not to deal with the dog ears on the half squares, so I'll use a Marty Michelle tool with engineered corners that allows me to trim those corners off before I even begin. And I'm going to trim on half, and the other half I won't trim. That way I can show on the video how both of these would work. The pattern assumes that those corners are not trimmed, so it talks about how you need to trim off your dog ears. The background fabric requires 8 2 7/8 inch squares and then 2 2.5 inch squares. And I can get those cuts by cutting my 2 7/8 inch piece first, getting my 8, and then getting my 2.5 afterwards. These also need to be cut in half once diagonally. And again, I'll be using the Marty Michelle tool to trim and engineer those corners, but I'll only do that on half of the blocks. You can use Marty's corner trimmer, or you can use any one of the right angled triangles out of any of Marty's sets. This just happens to be out of a half square triangle set because they all have the same engineered corner. You just simply place it on the triangle, matching up the right angle and the diagonal angle, and make the cuts. And you'll also need 2 2.5 inch squares. The large square, shown orange on the image, requires 4 3 3/8 inch squares and 2 2.5 inch squares. You will not be cutting either one of these in half diagonally. Again, I like to use a tool where the 1/8 inch markings are perforated and I can see easily where they are. I'll square this up to 3 3/8 inches. And I'll need 2 2.5 inch squares. I'm always very careful to make sure that my ruler is lined up on 3 sides when I'm cutting that 4th side. And again, I like to use a Marty Michelle tool that has the 1/8 inch markings perforated where I can clearly see them. So it's easy for me to make a 3 3/8 inch cut. Block 8 can be a challenge keeping all your little half squares separated. So you'll note that on the pattern I've indicated D1 for the dark outer arrow, L1 for the light outer arrow, D2 for the dark inner arrow, L2 for the light inner arrow. Take your fabrics, glue them, tape them, adhere them in some way to the pattern itself. That way you can keep your fabrics straightened as you're making your block. Whether you use tape or glue, it doesn't matter, just as long as you can see your fabrics and know which ones are going to be used in which places. So now I've got my key here, and I'll always be referring to that as I'm making my blocks. In block 1, you begin by making half squares. Now this time we are not going to be folding our fabrics in half and marking them and sewing on the line. Instead, we'll be taking actual half square triangles and putting them together with other half square triangles to form a half square. So the first thing I do is I'll match them up according to the pattern. The first block tells me to use 4 L1s, which for me is this light blue, and I'll match it up with the background fabrics. There's my set for the background light outer arrow, and now I'll make my background dark outer arrow. What you will have remaining are 4 dark inner arrows and 4 light inner arrows, and you'll need those later for these square and a square units. Once you have all of your pieces matched up with what the pattern indicates, you can go ahead and begin constructing those half square units. I'm going to chain piece my half square units, so I like to use a beginner to start. And then I will match up the half square units, matching the right angle and the points, and I'll stitch along the long diagonal side of the triangle. I'll stitch using a 1/4 inch seam. These are the half squares where I have engineered corners, so they lead into the machine a little easier because I don't have that point that I'm dealing with. When I've chain pieced my units, I like to use a chain ripper, which is just a seam ripper that sets in a base, to pop those units apart. And I can chain them as tight as 1 stitch. And because I'm using that seam ripper, I can pop those apart. It's a lot faster than taking the time to hold it and trim it with a scissor. The pattern calls for you to press the seams open, so you'll begin by finger pressing that seam before you set a hot iron to it. Set the iron to it for 5 seconds. I like to use a dry iron because I don't want to introduce stretch into my unit. This is a half square, and that diagonal seam is on the bias, so it would introduce stretch. This is the way a unit looks when I have traditionally pieced it. I'm going to need to trim those dog ears. And this is the way a unit looks when I've used a Marty Michelle tool with engineered corners. I don't have the trimming to do. Now, both of these units need to be measured and make sure that they're square before I move on. The pattern calls for them to measure 2.5 inches square. So I take the diagonal line of my square tool and I line it up at 2.5 inches, making sure that the diagonal stays in place. And then I would trim if I needed to in order to square it up. This unit is square. I only need to trim my dog ears. that unit is also square. So I can trim the dog ears simply by snipping them off with my scissors, or I can use the ruler and my rotary cutter. But it's just important to trim those dog ears so that you're dealing with a nice square unit. The pattern calls for you to make 4 of each of these units. Again, double check and make sure that you've chosen the right fabrics for your L1s and D1s, your L2s and D2s. If you have, you're ready to move on to step 2. In step 2, you're going to take the square that is from your large square fabric shown orange in the pattern, mine is red. And you're going to use your light L2 unit in the lower left-hand corner and your background unit in the upper right-hand corner. Lay them out on your mat and make sure that you have it going the direction that the fabrics indicate on the pattern. If you don't have them in the right spots, this isn't going to come out right. Now you can see that I've chosen an engineered corner for that half square on my background fabric, and I do that so it matches up perfectly. For this side, because I don't have engineered corners, I need to overlap roughly 3/8 of an inch, and you can see it when I flip it over that I overlap roughly 3/8 of an inch, and you can either eyeball that, or if you want to make sure it's perfect, you finger press your square, finger press your triangle, and match up those 2 finger press points. With that, I know that I have the center of my square matching the center of my triangle, and now I can stitch that. I'll go ahead and stitch off both edges, and then I'll press to the outside. When I use engineered corners, I can have the half square on top because I've lined up evenly with both edges of my square. The pattern calls that you would press each of these seams to the outside. Begin by setting the seam, setting the hot iron on the seam, fold it to the outside, and then just set the iron on there for 5 seconds. You'll note that I turn my block as I do my pressing on the other side so that I make sure it's pressed exactly the way I pressed the first side. Interestingly enough, sometimes when you press the opposite direction, you press it differently than what you do if you turn your block. It's not necessary yet to trim off those dog ears. We'll put the other pieces on instead. So again, I'll turn my block the direction that the pattern shows before I move on to step 3. In step 3, I place the dark unit on the lower right-hand side of the block, and I place another background square on the upper right-hand side of the block. The background square that I have here has engineered corners, so they're going to match up evenly with the sides of the block. The dark triangle that I have here is going to need to overlap slightly 3/8 of an inch, just like this light did. And I can see that overlap here on the back side. And I can either visually make sure that it's centered, or I can use the same pinch method to pinch the center of my block. The center of the triangle, and then line up the pinched section of the block with the pinched section of the triangle. I'll run those through my machine at 1/4 of an inch. The pattern calls for you to press these last 2 half square triangles to the outside. Again, you set the seam and then press to the outside. So now you can see the difference between when I have the engineered corners versus the non-engineered corners. I'm going to need to trim these dog ears before I move on. And before I go ahead and I move on, I want to also make sure that my block represents the way that the pattern indicates. My L2 is in the lower left-hand corner, my D2 is in the lower right-hand corner, and background units are at the top and the bottom. If it is accurate, I'll go ahead and take my square and make sure it measures 4.5 inches square. And I can see I have a little bit to trim off here on the upper edge. And now it measures perfectly 4.5 inches square. Before I move on, I make sure that all 4 of my units look the same and our fabrics are placed where they're indicated on the pattern. Step 4 of the pattern requires the use of 1 background fabric and 1 half square using the L1, the light outer arrow, and a background piece. Stitch those at 1/4 of an inch and press the seam open. Before I press, I make sure I have my half square in the correct position, and then I'll go ahead and I'll finger press that first. And while it might be more natural to press towards the background piece, it's important to press that seam open so that we have all the seams matching with the least amount of bulk later in our block. Again, I just hold that hot iron there for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 2.5 by 4.5 inches. And I measure it to make sure that it's accurate before I move on. Step 5 of the pattern requires that you use a D1 background half square and a D1 L1 half square. Position them the way the pattern indicates before you flip them over like a pancake and stitch them together. Once I have the 2 units stitched together, I take a look to make sure that my fabric's in their correct placement before I flip it over and press that seam open. Again, I'll finger press to train that seam before I set the iron on it for 5 seconds. This unit must also measure 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and I make sure that my measurement is accurate before I move on. Step 6 of the pattern requires that you take your unit from step 4, your unit from step 5, match the seams, and stitch them together at 1/4 inch. There are 2 ways of pinning this matched seam. You can either pin it in the uphill side of the seam allowance with a regular pin, like so. That way, when I stitch, once my needle falls into the seam allowance, I can remove my pin and I'll be sure that that seam stays put as it moves on down. Or an even surer method would be to match up those seams visually and then use a fork pin. A fork pin is a 2-pronged pin that allows you to put the prongs on either side of the seam so that it absolutely cannot wiggle as it runs through the machine. Go nice and slow when using a fork pin. It's a thin pin and you can stitch over it as long as you're moving nice and slow. This is my block with the fork pin. And I do like to remove it as I move along. And this is my block with the traditional pin in the uphill side of the seam allowance. Once my needle is seated in the seam allowance, I can remove my pin. When you pin properly, your seams will always match up perfectly. I check that before I go ahead and press. The pattern calls for this seam to be pressed open. Again, I finger press. And then hold for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 4.5 inches square. Step 7 calls for you to use a D1 background fabric and a D1 L1 fabric together. I made sure I had them in place before I stitched them at 1/4 inch. I finger press the seam open before I set my iron in place for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 2.5 by 4.5 inches, and I measure it to make sure that it measures accurately before I move on to the next step. Step 8 requires a D2 L2 half square unit and an L1 background half square unit. Fold them over like a sandwich and stitch along the side. Before I press, I double check and make sure that my unit looks like the pattern, and then I'll press that seam open by first finger pressing. The unfinished unit should measure 2.5 by 4.5 inches, and I measure to make sure it's accurate before I move on. Step 9 calls for you to use a unit from step 7 and 8 and put them together, matching the center seams. Again, I will use either a pin in the uphill side of that seam or a fork pin to hold the seam in place. Once I've stitched my unit, I double check that I have my fabrics in the correct location before I press the seam open. I finger press the seam first to train it open because I have quite a bit of bulk in that center. And then I hold my iron in place for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 4.5 inches square, and I double check the measurement before I move on to the next step. In step 10, you use a D2 L2 half square together with the smaller of your large square shown orange on the pattern, and for me that it's red. I'll flip that over and stitch along the L2 side. Before I press, I double check to make sure that I have the placement of my fabrics in the right location, and then I'll press this seam open as well. Finger press first, set the iron in place for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 2.5 by 4.5 inches, and I double check the measurement before I move on to the next step. In step 11, I take the 2 units from step 10, put them together like a sandwich, matching that center seam, and I can pin that seam in the uphill side of the seam with a regular pin or use a fork pin. Step 11 calls for you to press that seam open, so it's easiest again if you finger press to try to reduce that bulk in the center. Use your finger, your thumbnail to get that seam as open as you can, and then press the seam open, setting the iron in place for 5 seconds. This unfinished unit should measure 4.5 inches square, with the 2.25 inch mark coming straight through the center of the unit. Step 12 calls for you to take a unit from step 3, step 6, and step 9 together. You're going to be matching the center seams of the units on the outside with the pieced seams of the square and a square. The easiest way to do that is to take a needle, place it through your square and a square where it meets at the apex, and then take the same needle and place it through where the half square meets. Once you do that, you let the pin straighten the unit, hold it in place, and then pin it in place. I'll do the same with the other side. Place my pin through the apex of the square and the square. Place my pin through the point where the half square meets the seam. Let the pin do the work for me. Hold it in place, pin it, and stitch. And I'll press those seams open as well. In step 13, we'll be taking the 2 remaining square and square units from step 3, and putting them together with the unit from step 11 to form the center of the block. We'll take a pin and place it at the apex where the two seams meet on the square and a square unit. Take that same pin and place it in the seam line at roughly 1/4 inch. We'll let the pin do the work to straighten up the fabric and making sure that the pin remains straight. Pinch the fabrics together, remove the pin, and then pin the unit in place so that I can stitch at 1/4 inch. Once the needle is in the uphill side of the fabric, I can remove the pin and finish stitching to the end of the unit. Before I press, I make sure that my unit matches the pattern so that I have all my fabrics placed in the correct location. My seams match nicely there, so I'm going to finger press this unit open. This is so that it reduces bulk as I put all of the pieces together. I might need to use my thumbnail and press that center with my thumbnail nicely before I set the iron in place for 5 seconds. In step 14, when we put the full block together, we're going to use our top and bottom rows from step 12 together with our row from step 13. We're going to match seams where possible. And in this case, we're going to be matching the apex of the square and a square unit with the seam here. So we'll start with that. So I'll place a pin through the apex of the square and a square unit and through the seam behind it at 1/4 inch. Let the pin do the work in lining up those seams. Once I have them in place and my pin is straight, I'll pinch the fabrics together, remove the pin, and then put it in place. For the straight seams that are pressed open, I can use a pin in the uphill side of the seam or use a fork pin that goes on both sides of the seam. So you can see there I have so far a pin and 2 fork pins, but I need to turn the unit over because I have these square and a square units that I need to also pin, putting the pin through the apex and then into the half square where it meets the seam. Let the pin do the work. Remove the pin and put them together. The pin through the apex, through the half square where it meets the seam. Let the pin do the work. Remove the pin and pin the fabrics together. So this is going to be a rather unorthodox seam because I have 2 pins that are pinned on the other side, on the underside, and 3 on top. But it doesn't matter because I'm not sewing over those pins. I'll be stopping when the needle is in the uphill side of the seam to remove the pins. So as soon as my needle is in the uphill side of that seam, I'll remove the pin. Needle's in the uphill side of the seam, and I remove the fork pin. Needle's in the uphill side of the seam, I remove the center pin. Needle's in the uphill side of the seam, remove another fork pin. Needle's in the uphill side of the seam, and I'll remove the last pin. So before I press, I check once again to make sure that all my fabrics are in the right spots according to the pattern. It looks like the pattern, I'm ready to press. These seams also, like everything else, are going to be pressed open. So we start with finger pressing and training those thick points of the seams. Once it's trained, you can hold the iron in place for 5 seconds. When When it's all pressed, I like to turn it over and press it from the front side, making sure everything lays nice and flat. The last thing I'll do is edge stitch around that block because I'll be handling it several times while I'm manipulating it with my finished quilt. Now you can see I have my edge stitching in place and it's ready to go to the design wall. And that's block 8. Servants must remain watchful. If you have any questions along the way, give us a call, send an email, or put a message on our Facebook page. We'll be happy to get back to you as quickly as we can. Thank you and have a blessed day.